New York City police will involuntarily remove people that they deem to have mental illnesses from the streets and then put them in hospitals. This effort is being directed by New York City Mayor Eric Adams, who has prioritized clearing homeless encampments during his time in office, the New York Times writes.
Adams said city agencies will hospitalize people who are a danger to themselves, even if they pose no risk of harming others. The mayor argued that New York had a, quote, moral obligation to help these people. This is according to the New York Times.
Bet you're going to have some problems with this.
No, I think the question is, if you have a moral obligation to helping people, are you actually helping these people? Or are we doing what seems to be the gist of so many of his policies, which is sweeping the problem under the rug for the convenience of more affluent city dwellers who complain about having to see the socioeconomic inequity and the mental health issues that are rampant in our population.
Isn't leaving them to flail in the streets a form of sweeping it under the rug or ignoring the problem?
Sure. So it depends on what is actually being done and whether or not it's better or worse than the conditions that they're currently in. So we're talking about people now this is an admission that it's not even about public safety, which is a bell that they've been ringing very loudly, and Eric Adams has been ringing very loudly, despite there not actually being a commensurate rise in crime. And we've seen this now that the midterms are over, everyone stopped talking about crimes, and there have been dramatic reports about how across the ideological spectrum, everyone's just dropped that issue because it really was a media fabrication. So here he's not even saying this is about crime.
You mean in New York specifically?
Yeah. No, well, other places as well, but we're talking about New York specifically here. But now we're seeing, he's not even arguing that this is about an anti-crime initiative. This is addressing people who are not a harm to others, but maybe apparently are a harm to themselves, whatever that means. Now, the question is there going to be funding put toward mental health facilities that can actually accommodate the needs of this community? Or what does it mean? Because already the reason there's so many people who are on the street now is because we've seen a massive reduction in hospital beds. There's something now like 14 hospital beds for every 100,000 mentally ill people, not in New York, just generally speaking across the country. And in New York, you've seen a rise in the population and a rise in the reports of emotionally disturbed people from 2015 to 2018 by about 23%. However, in 2000, New York State had 6,555 certified inpatient psychiatric beds. By 2018, that number had dropped 12%, and it's continuing to decline. So I support, obviously, a program that's going to address the mental health needs of people, but I'm very skeptical if it's not coming along with a lot of reporting and conversation about all of these new facilities that are going to be built and staff that's going to be hired to actually attend to this population.
Well, in this story, Governor Hochul says she's going to be adding some number of hospital beds. I mean, we're talking about, according to this article, and this makes sense, we're talking about, I think, a few thousand people who are sleeping on the streets or in the subway with mental illness problems that this needs to be dealt with. So if you have 6,000 available hospital beds, in theory, that should cover it. I mean, maybe you don't have enough staff to support that. But you're right that it sounds like from reading this article the number, so because people are brought in and then they're let go when their condition improves slightly because somebody else needs the bed. So yes, there need to be enough support in the facilities for the people being brought in. Totally agree with that. But I don't think it's wrong, even if it's not. And I quibble with you slightly. This article says that it's still not a. We're not talking about so many incidents. There has been a rise in incidents on the subway. It's still a very small number, so maybe it's not socially significant. But even if it's a small number, and then it's just people who are in real distress, in obvious misery and suffering, I think something should be done to help them. So, just leaving them to languish
if something's going to be
does
done
not
to help,
seem.
What I'm doing is not being quite so credulous about the idea that rounding people up off the street and institutionalizing them is necessarily in their best interest. I think that it takes psychological evaluation. I think it takes whether or not if the evaluation indicates that there's some treatment plan that would be helpful to them. Is there enough staff and resources to make sure that treatment plan is followed, since people who are mentally ill kind of notoriously have difficulty sticking to their regimens? It's a big undertaking. And I also think, and I wonder what you think about this, there's some civil libertarian concerns about whether or not we have to force people to choose between being institutionalized, basically imprisoned in conditions that are often, frankly, commensurate with incarceration just because they don't want to live in a home or live in a street. Are you allowed to basically wander around the city, or are we going to say that that's a criminal act?
I mean, if you watch these people, I'm sure people understand what we mean by suffering from mental health problems. These are people who are shaking and muttering at all times, who are in
Robby,
such
there's a diversity of
suffering.
experiences that people have had.
That's what we're talking about.
And a lot of people, let's say, there's many people who are schizophrenic, relatively high functioning schizophrenics. They just don't want to be in one domicile. They want to live outside. They want to walk around, and they cause they're at various levels of risk to themselves. Now, again, we're not talking about risk to others. By Eric Adams' own admission, this isn't about risk to others. So, what is it that we're subjectively looking at people and saying they need to be institutionalized, or do they need a place to live so they don't freeze to death in the winter, like what happens to so many homeless people? Do we need to make sure they have access to food? Do they need to have access to showers and clean clothes and other kinds of resources? But that's not the conversation we ever end up having. It's about, are we going to lock them up?
That's what they need. They need to take antipsychotic medication. It's not about locking people up, because locking people up is good. We don't want to lock people up. But they need to be somewhere where they come down, where they are medicated and they're no longer having delusional episodes. They're not shaking uncontrollably. And then when you have that under control, you can figure out what the next step is.
I don't know that shaking uncontrollably is just, again, that seems like an optics thing that's more related to our comfort and perceiving them.
My comfort is about their comfort.
I don't know that that's true. Look, I think this is actually a very difficult conversation, and it strikes me as interesting that when we're talking about trans issues, we want to have all this nuance and everybody wants to have an opinion, and is this the best choice of action? We're talking about COVID. We're talking about, should we force drugs on people? Should we mandate this X, Y, and Z? And I have some concerns as a libertarian socialist about the coercive nature of these kinds of policies, and whether I'm just checking myself and my instincts about whether or not it's about my comfort as a middle-class person walking through the street and the internalized fear and stigma against homeless people that makes me think, oh, this is for their own good to lock them up and have them medicated and subdued in these kinds of ways? Or is this really about a public health issue and actually caring about them and their own interests and needs? And I think that kind of evaluation really does have to be made on a case-by-case basis, and the priority needs to be, do we have the social support systems that we would design if we actually wanted to help people, versus are we taking action that's designed to just get them out of sight first and foremost? And it's just not clear to me, given the complete lack of a conversation about prioritizing, reestablishing the mental health support that used to exist 10, 20, 30, especially 40, 50 years ago in the 1970s, which is the era in which a lot of the mental health facilities were shut down.
But a lot of that was shut down for the kind of, you're right, for the kind of concerns you're talking about of forcing people.
It seems to me that we had bad, underfunded, abusive institutions, and the default was, okay, let's just wash our hands of this, where at least we're not liable, so the people are in the street. At what point if we actually care, as Eric Adams said, about the well-being and the kind of ethical compulsion to help this group of people, what does that look like? And it seems to me that neither bad facilities or laissez-faire is the way to do that.
But it seems to me that clearing the encampments and moving people, having enough beds for them to places where they can get antipsychotic care,
which doesn't exist.
What do you mean?
I mean that's the issue. That's the conversation that we've had with so many guests on here that seem to be disagreeing, but what they're really quibbling about is that everyone agrees on the right solution, but given that solution doesn't exist, the resources don't exist, the beds don't exist, the rooms for homeless people don't exist, and not just mentally ill ones, but just homeless people in general, then there's different priorities. Some people are like, okay, well, they shouldn't have rights. If they have a drug addiction problem, they shouldn't have rights to housing. They should have to get their addiction addressed first. The other camp says, well, yes, I agree, but we also don't have addiction facilities. So what, should they sleep in the street in the interim? And so we go round and round in circles. Fundamentally, there's no resources. There's not enough housing resources. There's not enough drug addiction resources. And it's frustrating to feel like you're constantly pit against people. And we're all saying that we want the best thing for both people, for everybody involved. But the people in charge aren't acting in a way that would enable us to have, I think, what we could agree to be the best outcomes here.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right, well, I don't know if we're agreeing or not. I think maybe right. The debate is just that, between the people we've had on the show who'll say, yeah, we got to just get them off the streets, get them into housing, and then people will say, but that's not going to work, and they're not going to stay there. If they're still having significant drug abuse and mental health problems, we have to work on those first. I have tended to think those people have more compelling arguments, and yes, if more money needs to be put for that purpose, then we should do that in order to not have people sleeping on the streets, et cetera, which can be not a pervasive crime problem, but can have bad effects on people living in those communities and is not good for those people themselves. It doesn't feel, as libertarian as I am, as many concerns as I have, I don't want to incarcerate people. I don't want to lock people up contrary to their will. I want people to be free to be out and about in the city, even if they're making drug choices that I don't think are good for them. But I mean, when you see these people, it's a level of suffering that feels cruel to me to just say, well, can't do anything about it. Enjoy your tent until you die. Yeah,
it shouldn't be, we can't do anything about it. But I'm sorry, I keep hearing a focus on, like, I don't think that the living on, it seems like the conversation always tends to focus on the optics of what's going on as opposed to being centered on the well-being of the people involved. And maybe I'm being too cynical.
It's hard not to see them.
But who cares about seeing them? Like,
well, but when I see them, I'm struck by their suffering. I mean, I'm by their situation. My heartstrings are being tugged at, Briahna.
All right. Oh,
you don't believe it.
I'm not saying that. I would never want
you're going to break out the Grinch, the glimpse inside.
No, I think that most people, there's a mix of, look, I think that even the people who have distaste for the homeless, some of that distaste that I don't agree with is rooted in the dissonance that comes from realizing that you live in a society where you can be so relatively advantaged to someone else and still share that same space. And I think that dissonance is something that we should use to direct positive social policies, but it can be something that is used to simply brush things under the rug. So I do appreciate Adams using the language that says he's going to center the humanitarian cause of helping people who are mentally ill, but I look forward to continuing to following the story and see if actually he puts the money where his mouth is.
And he should take a page out of Muriel Bowser's book. There were under the bridge tent encampments here in D.C. that had been mostly closed, and they told you go in first, you tell the people that these are going to be shut. You give them time. You don't just show up and destroy all their stuff and arrest them all. There's a way to do it that minimizes the risk of some negative encounter. And I, like you, don't have a lot of faith in the police necessarily to do that, but it was done successfully here. And
where are those people now?
All of them were offered housing, and many of them took it.
And the rest?
I don't know if they all took it. It's hard to get these people to go into housing, but housing is available, here at least. We'll have more Rising right after this.